You are not trapped, but you will keep believing that. As long as nothing changes, there is a strange comfort in calling your life stuck. Because if you are stuck, then you are not responsible. And responsibility feels heavier than suffering. Carl Jung once pointed towards something uncomfortable. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. But what if fate is just repetition you refuse to interrupt? Look closely at your life, not the story you tell about it, the pattern underneath it. Same emotional outcomes, different people, different places, same internal feeling. A loop that keeps finding its way back to you. And you keep calling it coincidence, or bad timing, or bad luck. But repetition rarely asks permission. It just continues until something interrupts it. And that is the part you avoid seeing. Not because you are unaware, but because awareness demands action, and action requires responsibility. So you stay in explanation, you stay in analysis, you stay in understanding, without interruption. And slowly, that becomes your identity. I'm figuring it out. I'm processing. I need clarity first. But clarity does not arrive where movement is absent. It arrives after, not before. And this is where Jung becomes dangerous to read, because he does not let you stay innocent. He turns the mirror inward, not toward what happened to you, but toward what you keep repeating. There is a question you avoid without realizing. Not, why is this happening to me? But, why does this keep happening through me? That question shifts everything. Because now, you are not only observing your life, you are inside its structure. And structures are built through participation, not always conscious, not always intentional, but still yours. There are patterns you can feel before you can explain them. The same emotional tension in different situations, the same internal frustration, with different names attached, the same sense of being delayed, held back, waiting for something external to change first. But nothing external changes fast enough to explain the repetition. So the truth has to move inward. And that is where resistance begins. Because if you are participating, then you are not only affected, you are involved. And involvement means something unsettling. It means there is a part of your life you have not yet taken responsibility for. Not morally, psychologically. There are things you tolerate that you do not question deeply enough. Not because you like them, but because they are familiar. And familiarity feels like safety to the nervous system, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts in a predictable way. And so the cycle stabilizes. Not through force, through repetition. You do not stay because you are trapped. You stay because the exit requires disruption. And disruption requires you to become someone you are not yet used to being. Jung called this confrontation with the shadow. Not evil, not darkness, but everything in you that you have not integrated into awareness, including your patterns, including your avoidance, including your delay, and yes, including your responsibility. Because responsibility is not just action, it is recognition of your role in continuity. And continuity is what keeps your life predictable, even when it is painful. There is a moment in every life where suffering becomes familiar enough to feel structured, and structure feels safer than uncertainty. So even discomfort becomes a kind of home, not because you want it, but because you have adapted to it. And adaptation is not conscious choice. It is repetition over time. But here is where the fracture begins. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot fully unsee it. You may still live inside it, but you no longer experience it blindly. And that changes everything internally. Because awareness introduces tension between what you know and what you continue doing. And that tension is where responsibility begins. Not in change yet, but in recognition. You are not trapped in the way you think, but you may be participating in the very thing you call a trap. And now something shifts. Because once a pattern is seen, the mind does something subtle. It begins to defend itself, not against truth, but against responsibility. Carl Jung described the psyche as self-regulating. It protects its internal balance at all costs, even if that balance is built on discomfort, even if that discomfort has lasted years. So when awareness appears, something inside you resists it. Not loudly, quietly, through rational thought, through overthinking, through reinterpretation. You start explaining the pattern instead of interrupting it. You say it makes sense. You say it's complicated. You say there are reasons. And you are not wrong. There are always reasons. But reasons are not the same as resolution. And understanding is not the same as change. This is where avoidance becomes sophisticated. It stops looking like avoidance and starts looking like insight. You think more. You analyze more. You reflect more. But nothing actually moves. Because movement would require discomfort. And discomfort is where the ego becomes defensive. The ego does not fear truth. It fears loss of identity. And responsibility threatens identity more than anything else. Because responsibility implies you are not only shaped by your life, you are shaping it too. And that removes the comfort of being purely affected. There is a hidden relief in believing you are trapped. Because if you are trapped, you are innocent. And innocence is psychologically safe. It protects you from self-confrontation, but it also removes power. So the mind chooses a strange compromise. It keeps awareness. Without action, it lets you see enough to feel intelligent, but not enough to disrupt behavior. And this creates a loop. You recognize patterns, but repeat them anyway. You understand dynamics, but remain inside them. You can describe exactly what is happening and still participate in it. This is not contradiction. It is compartmentalization, a split between knowing and doing. And Jung would say, that split is where the unconscious takes control, because what is not integrated does not disappear. It repeats, and repetition is how the unconscious speaks, not in words, in cycles. You begin to notice something unsettling. You already predicted this outcome. You already felt this would happen again, and yet, you still moved into it. That moment is important because it reveals something deeper than ignorance. It reveals tolerance. Tolerance for patterns you already recognize as unhelpful. And tolerance is where responsibility quietly begins. Not in dramatic decisions, but in what you allow to continue. The psyche does not change through insight alone. It changes through interruption. But interruption feels threatening because it breaks familiarity. And familiarity is what the nervous system uses as orientation. Even painful familiarity feels like home to the brain. So when you attempt to change, you feel internal resistance, not from logic, from conditioning. The mind produces thoughts like, this is not the right time. I need more certainty. I should think this through more. But often these thoughts are not guidance. They are delay mechanisms, not intentional deception, but protection. The ego is trying to prevent destabilization of identity. Because if you act differently, you become unfamiliar to yourself. And unfamiliarity triggers internal discomfort. So you return to what is known, even if what is known hurts. There is also another layer. Emotional investment. The more you have invested in a situation, the harder it becomes to leave it. Not because it is right, but because leaving would mean the investment was misaligned. And the psyche resists admitting wasted energy. So it doubles down instead. It tries to make meaning out of continuation. It says, maybe it will change. Maybe I just need to try differently. Maybe I am close to figuring it out. But often, this is not intuition. It is attachment to continuity. Because stopping would require grief. Grief of time, grief of effort, grief of expectation. And the mind prefers continuation over grief, even when continuation prolongs suffering. So you stay in motion without progress. Thinking becomes substitute for change. Awareness becomes substitute for action. And explanation becomes substitute for responsibility. But underneath all of this, something quieter is happening. You are beginning to notice yourself inside the pattern, not as victim, not as cause, but as participant. And that is where discomfort deepens, because participation implies choice points you may not have honored, moments where something inside you already knew, but you delayed anyway, not because you didn't understand, but because understanding alone was enough to delay action. And delay, repeated over time, becomes structure. This is how avoidance becomes invisible. It does not look like refusal. It looks like waiting. It looks like preparation. It looks like emotional caution. But its effect is simple. Nothing changes. And life continues repeating itself in slightly different forms until eventually you no longer recognize the difference between pattern and personality. There comes a point where explanation stops working, not because you run out of reasons, but because reasons stop carrying weight. You already know too much. You can name the pattern. You can predict the outcome. You can even describe the emotional cycle before it unfolds. And still, nothing changes. This is where something subtle collapses. The illusion that awareness equals transformation. Carl Jung never suggested that insight alone heals anything. Insight only reveals structure, but structure does not dissolve itself just because it is seen. And so you enter a strange psychological space where nothing is new anymore, but everything is still happening. You begin to feel a quiet internal fatigue, not emotional chaos, but repetition fatigue, the exhaustion of already knowing, already understanding, already predicting, and still participating. This is where the psyche becomes honest with itself, not through clarity, but through exhaustion. Because exhaustion strips away justification. It removes the energy needed to maintain illusion. And what remains is simplicity, too simple to ignore. You see the pattern, and you are still inside it, not because you are forced, but because nothing has interrupted it. And interruption is the only thing that creates change. At this stage, something uncomfortable appears. Self-awareness starts to turn inward in a different way. Not, why is this happening? But, why am I still allowing this to continue? And this question does not feel neutral. It feels confronting because it removes distance between you and your life. There is no longer a separate observer, only participation. And participation without change becomes responsibility, not in a moral sense, but in a structural sense. Because what continues is what is permitted to continue. This is where Jung's idea of the shadow becomes alive, not as something hidden outside you, but as the part of you that participates in what you consciously reject. You may reject the pattern intellectually, but emotionally, you still enter it. You still respond the same way. You still delay the same decisions. You still remain inside the same emotional architecture. And this creates internal division between knowing and acting, between insight and interruption, between awareness and behavior. And that division is where suffering stabilizes. Because a split psyche cannot resolve itself. It can only cycle. So the mind tries to regain control through thinking, more analysis, more reflection, more understanding. But understanding begins to lose its effect. Because understanding without action becomes passive observation of your own repetition. And repetition, when seen clearly enough times, stops feeling accidental. It starts to feel chosen, not consciously chosen, but continuously allowed. And that is where illusion breaks, not dramatically, but quietly, in the realization that nothing external is holding you in place as much as internal continuity. This does not mean blame. It means visibility. And visibility is uncomfortable because it removes the story of helplessness, not all at once, but gradually. You start to notice where your energy goes, where you hesitate, where you negotiate with yourself, where you override intuition with delay, where you replace action with preparation. And slowly, the pattern stops feeling like something happening to you. It starts feeling like something moving through your participation. This is where many people turn away, because responsibility, once seen clearly, does not allow full return to innocence. You cannot fully unsee your role, even if you still struggle to change it. And that creates tension between who you have been and who you now realize you might need to become. And that tension is not resolved through thought. It is resolved through interruption, a break in repetition, a refusal of the familiar response, a moment where you do not follow, the usual emotional script. And that moment is small, but structurally significant, because it introduces something new into a closed system. And closed systems do not change from inside. They change from disruption. But disruption requires discomfort, because it breaks identity continuity. And identity continuity is what has kept things predictable, even when predictability was painful. So now the real question emerges. Not what is happening to me, not even why do I feel this way, but something sharper, something quieter, something harder to avoid. What am I still participating in that I already see clearly? And once that question is alive in you, something changes, not in your circumstances, not in the world around you, but in the way you can now experience them. Because ignorance no longer protects you. You cannot fully return to not knowing. You can still act the same. You can still repeat the same cycle. You can still delay what you already understand. But now, you see yourself doing it. And that is where discomfort begins. Not because something external has tightened around you, but because something internal has loosened its illusion. The illusion that you were only affected, that you were only reacting, that you were only waiting. Because now you can feel it clearly. There are moments you already knew. There are decisions you already sensed. There are patterns you already recognized in real time. And still, you continued, not out of ignorance, but out of familiarity. And familiarity is no longer invisible. It is now conscious. And what is conscious but unchanged does not remain neutral. It becomes tension, a quiet internal friction between what you know and what you still do. And this is where responsibility stops being an idea. It becomes pressure, because now even repetition feels different. It no longer feels like fate happening to you. It feels like something continuing through you. And that is the shift. Not guilt, not blame, awareness, clear, irreversible awareness. And once that exists, the question is no longer theoretical. It becomes immediate. What are you still participating in that you can no longer pretend you do not see? And in that space, something begins to form. A break in the pattern. Not yet action, not yet change, but the beginning of interruption. And interruption is where everything that follows begins. Because once you can see yourself repeating it, you are already no longer fully inside it. You already see the pattern. You already understand the cycle. You already recognize the repetition before it unfolds. And yet, your life still moves through familiar shapes, same emotional responses, same internal hesitation, same delayed decisions, same return to what you already know. Does not change you. And slowly, something becomes undeniable, not dramatic, just clear. Awareness did not stop it, so something else must. This is where responsibility stops being an idea and starts becoming a lived interruption. Carl Jung spoke about individuation as the process of becoming whole. But wholeness is not addition. It is separation first. Separation from unconscious repetition. Separation from inherited emotional patterns. Separation from the versions of yourself that operate on autopilot. And separation always feels like loss at first, because what you are separating from is not only behavior, it is identity. The identity of the one who waits, the one who overthinks, the one who understands but delays, the one who calls repetition circumstance. And when that identity is questioned, the mind resists. Because even suffering, identities feel familiar, and familiarity feels like safety. But safety built on repetition is not stability. It is stagnation that has learned to speak calmly. So something has to shift, not in theory, in behavior. There is a moment where you stop asking why you are stuck and start noticing what you are still doing. That maintains it. Not everything is within control, but repetition often is. And this is where responsibility becomes real, not as blame, but as recognition of participation. Because what continues, without interruption, is what is being sustained. And what is being sustained is always being allowed, somewhere inside you, even if unconsciously, even if reluctantly. And this is the part most people avoid, not because they cannot see it, but because seeing it clearly removes the comfort of delay. There is no longer a neutral position, only continuation or interruption. And interruption always costs something: comfort, familiarity, predictability, the identity that has formed around repetition. But it also returns something deeper: agency, not control over everything, but authorship over what you continue to participate in. This is what Jung pointed toward: not perfection, not purity, but consciousness that acts on itself, a psyche that no longer only observes its patterns, but intervenes in them. Silence is not avoidance. In this stage, silence becomes observation, without participation, space without reaction, a pause long enough to break automatic response. And in that pause, something different becomes possible, not because the world changes, but because you stop repeating it in the same way. This is where sovereignty begins, not externally, internally, when your attention is no longer fully owned by the pattern it used to serve, when your reactions are no longer automatic permission slips for old cycles to continue, when you begin to choose differently, even when everything in you feels pulled toward the familiar. And this is not a single decision. It is repeated interruption, again and again, until repetition loses authority and something quieter takes its place. Presence, not perfection. Presence, the ability to see the pattern and not immediately obey it. That is where freedom starts. Not when everything changes outside you, but when something stops repeating inside you. So now the question is no longer theoretical. It is direct. What are you still calling stuck, that you are actively maintaining through repetition? And what would happen if you interrupted it, even slightly, starting now? If this spoke to something in you, you can support this space by subscribing to Inner Phoria. And if you are willing to go deeper into honesty with yourself, write in the comments, "I choose my peace," not as a statement of perfection, but as a reminder that you are allowed to stop repeating what keeps you where you no longer want to be.